This short talk is attached to our screening of Ann Hui's 1982 film, Boat People, which will begin as soon as I end. This was the film that first brought Ann Hui to international recognition. It also drew controversy, mainly political in nature, mostly in the United States at the time. But even the complaints of the film's critics only serve to underline a more important feature of Boat People's reception: the surprised recognition that Hong Kong films were not all kung fu action movies. Today, in historical perspective, Boat People stands as an enduring and signature achievement of the Hong Kong New Wave. That movement got underway in 1979. This was also the year that Ann Hui made her feature film debut, contributing to that wave. That film is The Secret. At the time, Hui was 32 years old. She was already known in Hong Kong through her television work. Her first 3 feature films helped signal a new generation of Hong Kong filmmakers. Many of them also came out of television work, like Alan Fong, Chu Hock, and the ringmaster of them, Patrick Tam. Hui's television work was first in documentary and then in docudrama. Over the course of what followed, a long and prolific and still continuing feature film career, Hui has returned regularly to the research-driven, interview-based realism of her television films. So before I say any more about this artist, I would like to show you 2 clips of the director speaking about her working methods and her television experience. Now, one reason to do this is to hear Ann Hui's voice, to see her face, and to see her easy laugh. The first clip has her commenting on her method as a filmmaker. If we might see the clip. Now, in the second clip, Hui conveys something of the experience of working collaboratively in Hong Kong television in the 1970s. I almost wish that she would go on and I would stop, but I wanted you to see her because she's not here with us. She's in production, to see her face, hear her laugh, and to indicate that she's very conscious of the project that she undertakes and the methods that she uses. There are several reasons to recall Hui's TV work. The first is that Boat People was not her first film on the Vietnamese refugees, but rather her third. The first was a 42-minute-long docudrama made and shown in 1978, Boy from Vietnam. It was one of the 3 films that she made for the important anthology series mentioned in the clip, Below the Iron Rock, which ran on and off from 1974 through to 1992. The series was produced by the government-funded RTHK. The second reason is a bit wider and more complex. Television in Hong Kong played a critical role in the transformation and renewal of Hong Kong cinema through the second half of the 1970s, climaxing in 1979 with the rising of the New Wave. For one thing, it was such an important training ground for the young filmmakers that they sometimes affectionately called it their Shaolin Temple. Broadcast TV came late to Hong Kong in 1967. It came after decades of subscription, or what we would call cable TV, marketed only to the well-to-do. Broadcast, or in a British fashion, wireless television, came at a time when Hong Kong's economy and its politics were changing. The era of small-scale manufacturing work was fading. The era of Hong Kong's service economy was rising, and so were the incomes and opportunities of its populace. Indeed, a rising young generation, A generation born in Hong Kong, rather than immigrated to the city, were becoming keenly interested in representations of themselves, of their city, its politics, and its culture. This would be the generation of Hong Kong belongers. Although Hong Kong's broadcast stations started as delivery systems for imported programming, locally produced news and documentary, and then socially centered drama, comedy and variety shows locally produced soon dominated the Hong Kong airwaves. Hong Kong television became very popular, and households quickly equipped themselves with television sets. The attraction to young filmmakers, many of whom, like Ann Hui, had gained advanced professional training abroad, lay with Hong Kong television's openness to untried talent and to experimentation, as she mentions here in this interview. Like her colleagues, Ann Hui would seize on the opportunity to make ambitious television films, and the shows they produced were admired and widely watched. Born in Manchuria of a Chinese father and Japanese mother in 1947, Hui spent her early childhood in Macau and then took her high school and university education in Hong Kong. She graduated with a Master of Arts degree in Comparative English and Comparative Literature from Hong Kong University in 1974. She then traveled to England to study film production and gained another graduate degree. When she returned to Hong Kong in 1976, a choice that is significant in itself, she worked first briefly for the great director King Hu, and then began directing documentaries for TVB. Now, TVB was the biggest commercial broadcast station in Hong Kong. It was also, and this is truly significant to her film practice and that of her fellow filmmakers, it was the first television station to use 16 millimeter film as the principal production gauge. This meant that directors could handle their material much as filmmakers did, with greater flexibility. It also permitted them to do a great deal of location shooting, which became one of the key features of Hong Kong cinema in the 70s. After making some 26 documentaries at TVB, Hui then directed 6 dramatic films for the TV series sponsored by the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Soon after, she made 3 hour-long films, for RTHK's Below the Lion Rock. The series directly addressed the lives of Hong Kongers in docudrama form. In addition to Hui, 2 other future Hong Kong New Wave directors, Derek Yee and Alan Fong, contributed to the series. These films provided them with a springboard into feature filmmaking in 1979. Now, because of the huge popularity of Hong Kong action films, like those of Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and later of John Woo and Dante Lam, we tend to think of Hong Kong cinema as narrowly genre-based. We're not wholly mistaken. But television productions spanned a wider range of formats and opened and developed opportunities for family and social dramas. Now, when Ann Hui made her transition to feature films with The Secret, then followed by The Spooky Bunch, she did make genre movies. She made a murder mystery and then a semi-comical ghost story. But Hui returned to the Boat People, to her origins with her series at Below the Iron Rock, with her third film, The Story of Wu Vet, in 1981. The very next year, she followed it with Boat People, completing, in effect, a trilogy on the subject. Now, I want to say that Boat People was the major film of the 3 of them. The argument that I'm sketching is that the transformation of Hong Kong cinema, affected by the New Wave, was deeply prepared by Hong Kong television productions. The New Wave also represented the full return of Cantonese filmmaking to Hong Kong screens. This will require a little bit of explanation. Cantonese is the local dialect of Hong Kong and of southern China. Mandarin is the dominant dialect of the rest of China. And since the early 1950s, Hong Kong film production was divided between Cantonese studios, They mainly made modestly budgeted and often didactic family melodramas. They also made some other kinds of films like martial arts, and we saw one of those last night, aimed chiefly at local audiences. The wealthier Mandarin studios, like Shaw Brothers, which had moved to Hong Kong in stages between the late 1930s and the late 1940s, specialized in expensive costume and martial arts films for which Hong Kong cinema was best known in the 1960s and 70s. These films were also locally popular, but more importantly to the film industry, these films appealed to a significant portion of the export market. And as that market grew, so did they. Right? Whereas the Cantonese cinema shrank and shrank. So that by 1972, the successful Mandarin studios like the Shaws had eliminated Cantonese productions. In that year, none of the 90-odd films made in Hong Kong was Cantonese, was in the language of the city itself. Television is a very different story. It was almost wholly Cantonese, locally focused and locally popular. Quite quickly, TV stars like the comedian Michael Hui began to branch into feature films, and gradually Cantonese films began to come back. The Hong Kong New Wave rode this trend of transferring personnel from TV to feature productions, so that by 1980, in a complete reversal, all of the 105 Hong Kong feature films were Cantonese. None of them were Mandarin. This is one broad signal that a new generation of Hong Kong filmmakers had found an enthusiastic local audience. Now, Ann Hui was one of these directors, and she would, over the course of her long career, prove to be the most prolific after Chu Hawk, who's probably not a human being. Okay. Hui has made over 20 films to date. Her work is then understandably diverse. She has adapted novels, she has made martial arts movies, she's made ghost stories. However, her television docudrama roots come through many of her best films. Her métier is the intimate realist drama, though often set against a larger social problem or crisis. Now, because I've chosen to emphasize the role of Hong Kong television in the formation of the New Wave, and especially of Ann Hui's career, I would like to show some passages from The Boy from Vietnam, the first of her Boat People films, which Hui made at RTHK. But let me say a word first about the Boat People, and suggest why Ann Hui, herself an immigrant to Hong Kong, was so interested in their plight. Now, Canadians of an older generation will remember the Boat People well because Canadians, led by Canada's churches, were so generous in offering them refuge and a new start. More of the Boat People settled eventually in Canada than in any other country in the world except for the United States. After the North Vietnamese enjoyed their hard-won victory over the South and the Americans in 1975, shortly after that, the purges in the South began. Premier Le Duan imprisoned over 1 million people in camps. This set off a mass exodus of Vietnamese. These also include many ethnic Chinese, and the Chinese situation grew only worse after 1979 when China and Vietnam fell into war, and the Vietnamese government wanted to either exile or encamp the entire Chinese ethnic population. This crisis went on from the late 1970s right through the 1980s. And the Boat People quickly became a humanitarian catastrophe of enormous scale that stayed in the international news for months, if not years. What happened is, after they made their way overland to the coast of Vietnam, the refugees got on boats, hence their name. Now, many of these boats were never intended for voyaging on the open seas. Nonetheless, they ventured in hopes of finding sanctuary. Hundreds of thousands of them died in transit. Those that made it to nearby ports often faced brutal treatment. With a more compassionate and, let's say, orderly government than most places, Hong Kong was a prime point of sanctuary for those who could get that far, and a great many did. The Hong Kong government, with UN help, set up refugee camps. And these camps were soon controversial in an already crowded city, and the effort to relocate the refugees lasted for years. So the story that Hui tells with Boy from Vietnam, based on extensive interviews and research as the crisis was developing, seems simple in paraphrase. An adolescent, Ah Man, travels to Hong Kong alone, and after some abrasive negotiation, is given a bed and a room for the night. His cousin picks him up the next morning and begins to help Ah Man adjust to life in Hong Kong. The boy finds a job in a small copy painting workshop, and an older man befriends him. However, Hui complicates this simple plot in several important ways. One of these involves an interpolated flashback. Ah Man was intended to travel with his brother and sister-in-law, but a botched embarkation back in Vietnam isolated him. And this passage shows Hui can be very straightforward and laconic in her direction, but her plotting and narration can also include a startling complexity, even in this modest television production of only 42 minutes. So let's watch a piece from The Boy from Vietnam. One of the surprises of this film is, although it's very straightforward, very laconic, not very expensive, is Hui's inclusion of what might be called subjective or lyrical interludes. Her purposes in doing so are complex. As one of the boat people, Ah Man might have been regarded simply as a social problem for Hong Kong. However, Hui is more interested in his experience of Hong Kong. And so she used a device that she will often favor over her entire career, voiceover. She conveys Hong Kong in a passage we're about to see in typical guises. Crowds, movie-going, fast food, crowds, consumerism, crowds, using a soft but quickened montage. All of this appears under the umbrella of the private reflections of this young boy who's writing to his mother. The passage, I think, is a signal of Hui's sensitivity, that she does not so much deploy Ah Man as a type representing a social problem as much as she uses him as a narrative vehicle to show us a set of experiences as it's filtered through the subjectivity of someone who is inexperienced, right, and indeed quite naive. It's especially striking in a film of this kind, given the fabric of the film overall, the way in which she ends this passage, right, with the boy talking about himself and his aspirations, and then she lyrically swoops up into the lights, right, and then goes out of focus. This is for television, right? Yet it is so filmic in character. As I mentioned earlier, Boat People was Hui's fourth feature film. The leap in ambition and sophistication in her filmmaking from her television work, though the seeds of its development lie there, is really quite extraordinary. Not just an international success, Boat People broke box office records in Hong Kong itself. It had immediacy for the Hong Kong audience, and I want to come back to that in a moment. Boat People solidified one of Hui's major concerns, portraits of the rootless and marginal, people who must fit themselves into the edges. Her first and most pointed films focus this theme on the boat people. Her most personal statement of the theme comes, in fact, with her autobiographical work, Song of the Exile of 1990. This theme also suggests the strength of Hui's elective affinity for the Chinese author Eileen Chang, whose works she adapted twice. Chang's repeated experience of displacement from the 1930s through the 1950s made her an especially treasured, adopted Hong Kong writer. And Hui's same concern is subtly at work in two recent and unusually serene films, The Way We Are and A Simple Life. The critic Patricia Aaron sees in Ann Hui's mixed tendencies. She is a hard-hitting realist committed to social observation, but she makes narratives that move complexly and with great psychological subtlety. Hui inclines at times toward melodrama and sentiment, but much of the time she mutes these impulses and shows a cool regard for the events that she portrays. Hui has never staked her career or reputation on making a masterpiece. That kind of striving is far from her sensibility. Instead, she just goes on making polished, thoughtful films and making them often. The accents of her achievement, therefore, are best found distributed across her films rather than pivoted on one or two signatory works. In this regard, Hui reflects, in her exemplary professionalism, the virtues shared by the best Hong Kong filmmakers: modesty and persistence, resourceful craft, and close-kept perspective. There have nonetheless been peaks, like Song of the Exile and Boat People, and stronger phases in her career, as well as weaker films and more hesitant periods of her work. There have also been some thwarted projects. But I would like to say that the recent work, exemplified by The Way We Are, Night and Fog, and A Simple Life, suggests that Ann Hui's films, her best films, may yet to come. Some critics have been troubled by Hui's political discretion. It is hard to find moments of rhetorical directness in her films. It is unlikely that Hui is indirect because she is shy of controversy, for she's known controversy since her television days and has always met it with an even determination. No, her discretion may be rooted in a native political skepticism. In any case, the result is that Hui's preferred thematic strategy seems to be allegory. Hong Kong critics like Lee Chek-o-to have said of Boat People that it opens to a double reading. It is the direct story of naive man's discovery of terrible things he never expected of a revolution that he had respected and eagerly supported. Aku Togawa is a Japanese photojournalist and the protagonist of this film. He was a friend to the Vietnamese struggle. Indeed, the film first shows him photographing the northern troops as they marched in triumph in 1975. Now, as the film resumes, he returns 3 years after Saigon's fall to document the communist utopia he expects to find is now under rapid construction. The film then follows him through the phases of his disillusionment as he encounters the drastic darkening that really surrounds him. Hui's episodic plot ensures that this progress is at first gradual and uncertain, but near its end, Boat People accelerates and then rises to a melodramatic climax. That's the first reading, fairly direct, the one that we gather rather quickly. The second reading, the one that Lee and others have suggested, is that Hui's Vietnam, depicted as in 1978, is also an anxious allegory of Hong Kong after 1997's handover to China. That eventuality was already on the horizon in 1982 when the film was made, at least for those paying attention, and Ann Hui is someone who pays very close attention. The joint declaration between Britain and China that set that date and the terms of the handover comes 2 years later in 1984, but in 1982 it is still a matter of thought and consideration. The large Hong Kong audiences for Boat People that kept this film on the screen for months in a market where success is usually measured in weeks of screening time, were not only watching the story of the Boat People, whose arrival had become an immediate abrasion to their own society and a conundrum to themselves about what to do, but they were also watching, in the allegorical sense, in that second reading, a possible destiny that might await themselves. The at first naive gaze of the Japanese photojournalist is not wholly unlike their own perspective as urbane and cosmopolitan Hong Kongers. But life at the hands of a revolutionary power in a vindictive mood directed toward its own people was not, Hong Kong Chinese knew perfectly well, the exclusive fate of the Vietnamese of the South. Many of them a generation before had fled from China's own South in the face of the 1949 Communist Revolution and had struggled against much hardship to find a place for themselves and their families in Hong Kong. Hui directed their attention to possible resemblances between them and the boat people that had been easy to miss and called upon their compassion in doing so. To conclude, I want to emphasize that Ann Hui never makes this second reading into an open statement in Boat People. She is and will always remain a reticent political director. On the other hand, Boat People is an emotionally direct film, one whose facts and anecdotes come from Hui's interviews and research that she wove into this episodic form. The film only carries the shadow of political and moral intimations of something closer to home, which Lee calls the China factor. In the Hong Kong films made later, made after June 1989, but still, we might say, in the wake of Ann Hui's Boat People, films famously like Chu Hawk's Better Tomorrow 3 of 1989 and John Woo's Bullet in the Head of 1990, in those films, the Vietnam allegory becomes more brutally obvious, becomes a rhetorical trope in two hyperkinetic action films. But when Ann Hui touches on this subject, this was, recall, for the third time in her career. And the immediacy of the film's drama and the suffering of her characters that we feel is what most counts for us, perhaps. It is Hui's empathetic melancholy that eventually seems to singe everything we carry away from Boat People. This is not a cheering film. But this is a very different thing, and one is strongly inclined to say this is Ann Hui's alone. Thank you.